Hi, everybody. Welcome to this YA Science Fiction Fantasy debut panel, late night edition. I've been having some internet issues, but hopefully everyone can hear me if you can't see me. Um, we are doing the late night edition for a variety of different time zones. This is also like the latest panel I think I've done on the channel, so I'm very excited for that. And this lineup is really amazing. I had the most fun time with these books for this panel, so I'm so happy that it worked out. If you don't know who I am, my name is Lily. I am the moderator for this panel and kind of the person behind Utopia State of Mind. We're going to have all of our authors introduce themselves, and then we're going to go into the questions that I had kind of immediately, sort of info dumping or whatever the reverse is when I finished everybody's books. And then if anyone has any questions during the live, then you can drop them in the chat, and I will remember to go back to them at the end. So let's just start off with our author intros. Keisha, do you want to start?
So my name's Keish Chow. I'm from Australia. I'm a young adult fantasy writer, and my debut novel is The Girl with No Reflection.
And hi everyone, my name is Tigis Gurma. I'm an Ethiopian writer based in Melbourne, Australia. And my debut YA fantasy novel is called Immortal Dark, and it just came out in September.
Hi, I'm Winnie Lee. I am the author of YA Horror The Dark We Know, which came out a couple of weeks before Tigast in August. And I'm very excited to be here.
So my first question today for everybody is, now that everyone's book is released, I wanted to know if there were how release went and if there are any unexpected experiences during that time or since then, any unexpected experiences that you thought based on your preconceptions about release or not, and then post release.
I guess for me, I actually had a lot of personal stuff going on around release date. I actually had to move out of my house because a while ago our house flooded with a burst pipe. So, and I had some health stuff going on as well. So it was all just really full on. And I think the thing that I found the most difficult about releasing is how hard it would be to talk about a book that you'd kind of moved on from. Because most of us, because of the timelines of traditional publishing, we're sort of ahead by one or two books, and so we're sort of completely immersed in new worlds or new storylines, and then to have to go back and promote this book was really I found it difficult. I don't know about the others, but
Yeah, I agree. That was a bit tricky, going back a year in my mind and being okay. So, because I'm also working on a series, I was I can't spoil book 2.
Yeah.
I'm really working on book 2 at the moment. I'm promoting book 1, but I think one of the nicer experiences or surprising experiences was also because it is a launch event. I didn't expect people to have read the book, and there were some people in the audience that have read the previous copies or the early copies, and it was so nice because then I didn't feel like I was just talking to a room introducing a new concept. There were some readers in the room that kind of knew what I was talking about, the characters, and I think them coming up and saying hi made it all really sweet and not as nerve-wracking. So I'd say that.
Yeah, for sure. I'm definitely in the same boat. I think it's weird because you're so divorced from it at this point, but also it's been just yours for 2 years, and then suddenly it's out and people are getting to receive it. And the downside of that is that people are perceiving you, but the upside of that is that you get to meet people who've read the book and who are talking about the book, and it feels nice, I think, because it feels like you actually did do something rather than it just marinating in your brain for 2 years. But weirdly enough, I also had a lot of personal stuff going on at the same time as debut. I was also moving house. I was also on deadline for a second book. Unfortunately, that's how it goes. If you're doing one book a year, you're probably gonna be on deadline for the second one by the time the first one comes out. So it was a lot of chaos, and I feel like the important thing for me was just making sure that I was carving out time to celebrate the debut, because otherwise it can be quite like anticlimactic, because you sort of build up to it for 2 years and then suddenly it's just like, oh, okay, it's on shelves today. Great. You do, like one event. So I feel like it's really important to like make time for yourself, or like it was important for me to like make time for myself and to like do something to celebrate, and to like, go out with my friends, or like put up a post and stuff like that, just to make it feel for myself like it was out, which is a weird experience. I think publishing, going from something like so personal to something that's like public and like something that's kind of like commercial, is always a weird feeling, and you always want to try and like ground it back in yourself.
For sure.
My next question, now that we've talked about post-release, is to go back to before release, sort of to the idea of the novel itself, right? So I would love to know from all of you, what was your first impression or memory of your debut? Like, how did this concept come to your mind? And how, I'm sure a lot has changed since that moment, but I would love if you could share maybe like a few ways that has changed since it like came into your memory, or not memory, but like into your consciousness, I guess.
Well, for me, the first opening scene, which is like kind of a spooky, atmospheric kind of opening where someone, well, the main character is like looking in a reflective surface, which is like a pond in this instance, and looking at her reflection, and her reflection is smiling, but she's not smiling. That was like one of the first images that came to my mind. And it basically, like, I have a very overactive imagination, which I think is really common in authors. Like, I think we obviously, like, live a lot in our heads. And so, and I've always been like quite scared of mirrors. So that was like sort of an image that repeatedly came to me when I was trying to avoid looking in mirrors myself. So yeah, that was the very first thing. And then I actually went looking for like a mirror story. I sort of read a lot about mirror superstitions on the internet, which is like probably the worst thing you can do if you have a phobia of mirrors, to like go looking to, because a lot of them are quite creepy and to do with like death and stuff. But yeah, and then I stumbled across a short story that sort of had the very basic bones of this concept, which is a story by a Spanish writer called Borges. And yeah, the story is called Fauna of Mirrors, and it sort of had this basic concept, and then I just sort of built on it from there. And apparently that story was originally based on Chinese folklore, so I thought it would be a good kind of conduit to put in as much like Chinese mythology as I could possibly cram in. So that's
so cool.
The first impression of my book.
That's great. I love that. And so creepy.
I'm like sitting in front of a mirror right now, so I'm gonna keep trying to block it.
Yeah, just me spreading my trauma around to everybody.
Love that. First impression of my book, I think it came to me. I'm pretty sure I saw a prompt on Twitter that said, "If your book was a movie, or what would your book's opening movie scene would look like?" And I was like, I'm gonna try to do that for Immortal Dark. And I was like, I started typing it up, and I started with a prologue, because I was like, how would the movie even open up? And I was like, it has to be in the dean's office in the university. And she's talking to her vampire, and they're talking about going and getting a girl to come inherit a house within the university. And then as I was writing that, I figured out my main character was Kidan, who has recently killed someone. And I was like, that's so interesting. You are a very dark character. I want to know more about you. So sort of, it came to me quite a funny, interesting way, because it's like a movie in my head, basically. And I feel like a lot of readers have said it's very cinematic. It reads like a very visual text. And I love that, because a lot of my inspirations came from, Vampire Diaries, the originals, all of the great vampire shows. So I really used that prompt, which is like, the opening scene of your book, to really help me figure out what the world was and who the main character was. So that's my first impression of my book.
It's so cool that the character just sort of popped into your head and then you're curious about them.
amazing.
It's so nice when that happens, rather than like you just like setting out to create them. Yeah. I could probably give you the exact date actually that I came up, that like I had the first idea. It was something like 26th May of like 2021 or something, because I tweeted about it the exact same day, and I've always gone back to that tweet. I think the tweet was, I want more media that makes me feel the way that Spring Awakening makes me feel. So it was like during the pandemic, I was big into like Spring Awakening, which is like this play turned musical, which has a kind of a concerning plot whenever someone searches it up. But I promise you it makes sense in the book. But yeah, it's very angsty. I was particularly thinking, I think, because of COVID and because I was separated from a lot of my friends at the time, I was sort of fixating on this song in the soundtrack called Those You've Known, in which the main character is sort of sitting at the graves of these two friends who have died during the course of the musical. And he's about to kill himself, and then the ghosts of his friends sort of rise up and um, prevent him from doing that and convince him to keep living on. And I think I fixated on that quite a lot during like pandemic isolation. And I started thinking, the musical ends here, but what does this decision look like 2 years down the road? What does the aftermath of like healing and like deciding to, keep living look like? What happens when the character who ran away during the musical comes back and is reunited with, this character who continues living, and what does that shared healing look like, what does that shared trauma look like. So it really took on a life of its own from there. It became this story about a girl returning to her haunted hometown and reuniting with this childhood best friend, who they're both like haunted by the same death by, and setting out to stop the thing that killed their friends in the first place. It really became like a speculative kind of horror twist on Spring Awakening, which is kind of very niche and very me. Um, and I think to answer like the second part of your question, how it changed over time, I don't know if like Kasha and Tigges, you want to get back to that. But yeah, I think weirdly enough, now the book has quite a lot of religious undertones. I grew up religious, and the setting became like quite a religious small town, and a lot of their like trauma and a lot of their sense of like repression, especially to do with like their queerness, comes from that context. But in the original drafts and all the way like up till I sold the book, there were barely any religious elements at all. And then in the period of like while we were on sub, I was reading Andrew Joseph White's Hell Follow With Us, which is an incredible YA horror. Everyone should read it. It is getting, turned into an animated film, I think, which I'm super excited about. But yeah, I think it's, set in the setting of like a Christo-fascist cult, and the way that Andrew wrote about religion and wrote about the character's relationship to faith really struck me and sort of unlocked how I wanted to talk a little bit about my sort of ex relationship to faith. And then the book became, and then I sort of started unlayering a lot of religious elements in the book. So it is now partly about that.
Amazing. I love that. Mine didn't change that much, so
Yeah.
I only had to do more revisions on just expanding the world building. But that first original scene of just a school of vampires and humans, that didn't really change that much. It was just expanding on the themes of darkness and accepting yourself after you do something unforgivable.
My first chapter didn't change hardly at all. It had a little
I
bit
am
of
so
like,
jealous. I
clarifying
rewrote
stuff,
my
and
first chapter.
yeah,
So
almost everything else changed. I structurally had to edit it a lot, because the first iteration, and I think it's I think we're going to circle back to like sort of what we grew up reading, but the first iteration of the book had almost a third of it was like just all battle scenes because I grew up reading a lot of epic fantasy, so there's a lot of battle scenes, and I think my editor was like I like the battle scenes, but like let's tone it down because YA fantasy readers might not want quite like that much war. So that's the main thing that changed.
I found it super fascinating because one of the things that I really enjoyed were like the battle scenes. But I found it fascinating because I guess it is true. Like obviously, you can't have all battle scenes all the time. You need to have some moments in between and like after and stuff like that.
Yeah. Very true. I think it was just a question of audience. I think like for a certain audience, probably like a third battle scenes is probably like very great. But yeah.
I think that's a great segue to one of my next questions, which is kind of about what are some world building elements that don't make it into the book? What are some behind the scenes, like, pieces of the world that just can't make it in for whatever reason?
So I had a probably a pretty unique situation in that this book is obviously like released as a standalone, but I had originally pitched it as a duology, and I've got sort of a second book kind of outlined, and so I did have to hold back quite a bit of world building stuff and just sort of plot things and I guess like explanations because of that, just in case. And it's a matter of kind of like the publisher kind of saying like, we'll see how book one goes first, and then we'll see if we can commit to a sequel. So that's kind of like where I'm at the moment. And so it was a really tricky balance, I'd say, like kind of holding back enough and leaving enough sort of open threads that if we had the opportunity to, we could expand on them, but also tying off things well enough so that it was functionally a standalone as well. So yeah, I probably can't go into like too much detail just in case, but yeah, there's like sort of background information on some of the creatures and like sort of why they're there and like their role in the world, and some of the unanswered questions, like for example, like why main character like hears screaming when she like goes underwater and stuff like that. Like those sort of things are stuff that I've kind of planted in case there's a book two. So yeah, that's where I'm at.
That's the best part, I think, planting stuff in book one in the hopes of, you get to. With me, I got really lucky that they were like, they wanted 3 books. So I really planted some things in book one. And I used to say like, I don't like world building because I'm not good at it. And I used to really believe that for a while. And that's why I sort of set my world within this world. It's a contemporary fantasy because the university takes place in our world, and I don't have to come up with travel plans or food or what I mean. I didn't want the high fantasy stress of world building, but then I proceeded to create my own philosophy in the university. And then I started to create my own vampire lore within the university. So I did do a ton amount of world building. I didn't really escape it. And turns out I do like it. I just have to pick which parts I focus on. So for Immortal Dark, the phrase that came to my mind first was, humans can only feed on specific human bloodlines. And that was the only thing that popped into my head. I was like, that's such an interesting phrase, even the concept of it. So I was like, but then why? And I think world building is the question of answering why until you get tired. And I asked myself, why does that happen? And then this lore came about who created these restrictions on these vampires. Okay. And then how and why? How would the students of these families learn about their fate, about, how to feed, how their legacy is to feed vampires? And I was like, okay, they need a university, they need an education system. And then how would I teach them this? Maybe a philosophy class. And it just spirals until I get like, I'm like, okay, that's enough world building for now. And I think my favorite way of world building is including journals or texts from other parts of the book. And I think that's it's just, I love writing historical texts within the book to just give you a bit of context. I think that's the best way to world build when you have so much dense background and philosophy like my book does. So I think I really enjoyed that part most. What about you, Wen?
Yeah, I feel like we're going on like decreasing levels of like world building here because we're going from like a high fantasy to like the contemporary fantasy. And then mine is like magical realism. It's horror, it's very contemporary. There's not technically a ton of like magic world building. But I mean I did do a bunch of like world building in the setting, I guess. Because it's sort of like vaguely an American town, but I'm not American. I didn't want it to be like a specific American place. I sort of wanted it to be almost like allegorical. I wanted it to feel slightly like fairy tale-ish, feel slightly like surreal. So it like draws inspiration from like real places, but it isn't like an actual place. So I did get to play around with like world building in the sense that I could like create like weird spots in this town where strange things happen. I could create like weird buildings in this town that are like very gothic inspired, but that don't necessarily quite have to follow the rules of like real life, which is really fun. Yeah, so I think I did because I was encouraged between like revision drafts to like really build out the world building, because it wasn't a real town, but they wanted to make it feel like it could be real, which was a very valid comment. So I did end up going like down a whole rabbit hole of like exploring all these different places in the town, which also meant like similarly, I ended up with like a lot more lore in my head than could actually be in the book, which I think is always the sad part about writing. You're like, I have so much information and like I would love to share it, but it just doesn't actually fit the book. So you have to find like, I don't know. I mean, I guess if you're like lucky enough to write a sequel, then it can go in there. If not, it's just like Easter eggs and fun things. Maybe like bonus short stories. But yeah, there's like buildings that I created like whole histories for, like family, like that I like built out generations for, because the book is about a lot about families, and there's this like one rich family that has like a lot going on. So I had like multiple generations of that like in my head that doesn't quite make it into the book. Yeah, stuff about, you know, I think things about their past, especially because it's quite character driven, and especially because the book is so much about these like two dead friends, that sort of like haunt the narrative. There are sort of like flashbacks in the book, and a lot of them got taken out or rewritten. So I have a lot of their past actually that got built out that didn't make it into the book, which was kind of sad for me because I was just sort of doing it very indulgently. I was like falling in love with these like dead characters as they were, and I was like writing so much about them, like when they were all alive together, like in their childhood, when they were like still happy, that like by the end of it I was like kind of sad that they were dead. Like I was kind of sad that I couldn't bring them back, but I killed them, so I
Oh,
but yeah, I
heartbreaking.
think that's, yeah, so it lives on in my heart, as a lot more deeper lore that makes it into the book. But I hope like that, I think the nice part about that is that that helped me explore their characters and understand their characters in that process, and I hope that sort of depth comes through in the scenes that do make it into the book, even if half of it got cut out.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, that is secretly my favorite reason about why I ask this question, because I love hearing about everything that goes into a world that doesn't make the page, but like that are totally essential for you all to know, to even get like a sense of, everything from the little details to the big details about like the stuff that are so necessary, even though we don't necessarily see it, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, completely.
I want to ask now some questions about specifically about the books. I also want to remind everyone in the chat that if you have any questions, you can drop them in the live chat and I will remember to get back to them. And it's kind of about something that we've already touched upon a little bit, but it's siblings and family. And so siblings are a huge theme in Dark We Know and Immortal Dark. I love how both of your books kind of examine paths we don't take, like the paths that our siblings, are exploring that we're not. So I wondered if you both could talk about creating these side characters, how you managed to infuse pieces of their character, into the story and the story for your main characters, and developing a side character for the side character's sake versus also, or in tandem with also, what needs to happen in the main character storyline or the story as well.
You want to go first, Gwen?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I guess for some context, so Issa, who is the main character, who is the girl who comes back to town, she has an older sister called Trish, who has remained in this town all the time. And their dad was abusive, and he's recently just died, leaving behind Trish and their mom, who's sort of always been a little distant. She's not been very good at like protecting them, from their dad. So Issa's always been sort of resentful. And Trish is sort of like the elder sister who's caught in between this. Their mom was also a very young mom, so she and Trish are almost like older sisters in themselves. And so Issa's sort of caught between, this Trish's loyalty to her and Trish's loyalty to her mom. And I think it's always interesting for me because I'm an eldest daughter myself. But all my main characters so far have not been eldest daughters. They've been like younger daughters or like only child, but they always have an older sister figure. So I always say that, like, if you want to look at me, like, look at the older sister side character that always appears in the back of the book, because that's always, I guess, like, part of my subconscious is always like projecting as elder sister into the story somewhere. But I think the way that you put it, paths not taken, in describing siblings is really interesting because, especially for my book, I think it's so much about family. It's so much about the house that you grew up in, and wondering whether you can really ever escape that house and escape the place that you grew up in. And I think that's such an interesting way to put it, especially because specifically, like, a point of tension in the book is that Issa managed to leave and Trish didn't, and Trish was sort of forced by obligation or by circumstance to stay in this town with, you know, their dad and with their mom, and she's had to take care of their mom, and she's had to be responsible for their mom, and that is a point of tension between them. And I think Trish is also really important in the overall sense because she's someone that's always been there for Issa, you know, despite Issa's otherwise sort of alienation. And I think a lot of the book is about her coming back to herself and sort of understanding that she's always deserved love, and understanding that she's always, you know, deserved like this sense of innocence. And I think the sisters' relationship is really important in that sense because even though there is Issa sort of reconciling with her childhood friends, I think reconciling herself within the home and within the family, which has been like this original trauma, is really important. And she and Trish are sort of like parallel journeys in sort of healing themselves within the house and within the family and with their mom. And so they act as sort of like foils with each other. They act as sort of people who've like always unquestionably supported each other, and it's sort of this like background love and background support that I think they both need to realize has always been there, and that is sort of a big turning point and a big anchoring for them as they go into like the final part of the scene. And it's a big part of, I think, Issa managing to start that healing process. So yeah, I think, and you know, also in reverse, Issa sort of helping Trish get a bit more agency and figure out her own autonomy. So yeah, I think it's really interesting, like sibling relationships, because they can have a lot of resentment and they can have a lot of distance, but ultimately, because they are so rooted in this, we grew up in the same place, and you are the only one who like knows exactly, you know, where we both came from. I think that's really powerful, and it's this like inexorable original bond that keeps them like sort of coming back to each other. It makes it really interesting story wise, to explore the different parts of themselves that they both represent, or they both need to get to, or they both like give to each other as a product of this house. I think there's a lot of gothic themes in there, so the house and the family keeps like coming up again and again.
No, I agree
Yeah.
with I agree with how you said it's just such an interesting dynamic, especially when there's the older protective sibling. And I have that in my book as well with Kidan. They're basically twins, but she's the older one. And she really takes on the older sibling role really quickly because of June, her sister, has always been the sweeter, gentler soul, and she suffers from these horrible nightmares. So Kidan has stepped into this role of taking care of her always. And when she's kidnapped by a vampire, Kidan spirals. You know, she needs to go and find her and bring her home, and bring her home at all costs. They're quite codependent on each other as well, because they grew up far away from this vampire society. They grew up in a foster home that wasn't very pleasant. And I think when they only had one another, especially when you only have one other sibling and no other family around you, you really form this unhealthy attachment to them. You know, they're your person. They're the only one that get you and that matters in the world. So when that love is taken away, I'm very curious to know how that impacts you as a person, and it impacts Kidan very horribly. She's quite blinded by rage and revenge, and that's when we see her first on the page, right? She's been looking for June for months on end, and she's gotten nowhere. And finally, she gets the news that the vampire that took her has settled in their family house and is trying to inherit that house. Now she has to go and live with him and try to, find June and all that. So sibling dynamics. What drew me to that? I can't tell you what drew. I am the older sibling to my younger brother, but then I also have a older brother. Does that make sense? So I'm the middle child, and I don't have a sister though. So funnily
Oldest
enough,
daughter.
yeah, I am. Funnily enough, all of my previous works have had a sister dynamic in them. Maybe that's because I don't have one. I'm just so curious about that bond. It always drew me into how they would just, I don't know, take care of each other. But at the same time, like you said, there's resentment. When someone's always the protector and the other is the protected, you feel sort of, you do it out of love, but at the same time, you kind of want to be protected back as well as the older sibling. It's a lot of sacrifice. You sacrifice so much of yourself just to make sure that person is well taken care of, especially if you don't have a great parental figure. You take on that role. So, Kidan's journey in this book is trying to sort of maybe put herself first, which she doesn't like to do. She likes to focus on other people and take care of them. And I think that's why her relationship with the vampire Susenios, who's all about taking care of himself first, is quite interesting. He's an immortal, this arrogant guy that's just like, you have to love yourself first. And she hates him for that. She hates that he loves himself because she quite for that. But yeah, that's my sibling dynamic. It's quite interesting. And I love how it's developing because it's a series in book 2, how it keeps going. I can't say anything, but I want to talk about book 2, but I can't. But there's more there that we're gonna unravel with these two sisters.
Yeah, I love how the 4 of these siblings have all like such different start points and end points for both of your books, like when they start and when they end, but are all kind of grappling with, some of the common themes you're all talking about like the ways that these experiences shape two people who at some points in their life are very, very similar and are very, very on the same path, and then divert in different ways, and then maybe, change their mind or come back. I want to ask now about The Girl with No Reflection, and specifically also the trust and trust issues, I guess, in The Girl with No Reflection. And I would love to know from like a writing perspective how you handle kind of creating tension, doubt, and trust, especially when you have all layers of not knowing kind of who to trust and what to trust, I guess, since we're talking about like your reflection in mirrors and everything like that.
I think, in the book, I obviously like the reasoning behind me writing a mirror book was just because mirrors are scary, but also I wanted to use mirrors as a bit of a metaphor for, I guess, like, how we see ourselves and the perception of ourselves versus like the reality, because obviously like a mirror or a mirror image is like a very superficial like picture. It's like our physical appearance, but not necessarily like, it doesn't say anything about like who we are. And I think, it also comes from, being on social media a lot and like seeing your reflection a lot, like on the screen, like, I think we're not really equipped as humans to like see ourselves like so much. So I think that for me, all the trust issues really came up with like me playing with the idea of like, if someone's appearance or like how they appear outwardly might not necessarily be like what they truly are on the inside. And so, and if you had a reflection that was a sentient creature and they were their own person and they were forced to like mimic you all their lives, like what sort of personality would they develop from that? Like what sort of bitterness or resentment would they develop from having, that sort of life imposed on them? And I think the whole book is sort of, I wanted to really explore like, perceptions and identity and things like that, and how that might not necessarily be like the true representation of what a person might be. So, I guess it was more about just like creating the characters and making sure that they're really distinct. So, even though the reflections of the main characters were identical in appearance, I had to work to make them very distinctive in personality. And one of the first sort of encounters that Ying, the main character, has with her reflection, like that scene actually took a lot of work. Like I rewrote that scene many, many times because I just wasn't really nailing that interaction. What would it be like if you sort of, had been looking at your reflection all your life and thinking that it was just like this inert thing that was like a reflection of you, and then all of a sudden you learnt that this was actually like a separate person. Like how would you react to that? Because on the one hand, like talking to your reflection, I don't know whether anyone else talks to their reflection. I do, maybe it's just me, but I think like you're very comfortable like talking to like your reflection, or you think it's just yourself, but then if you found out that was actually a separate person, like it would be terrifying, obviously, but also like would you be a little bit curious about like what sort of person they were, like how different they were to you? Like I think I was trying to capture that sort of dual like fear but also curiosity that would drive the main character into like making the decision to I guess connect with this mirror creature rather than just immediately being like no. So that was kind of where it came from.
Yeah, I loved that specific aspect, and that like made me feel almost like I was reading like this Black Mirror-esque kind of thing. Wait, is it called the like the series, right? That's called Black Mirror? Am I just making this up because we're talking about mirrors?
I think that one was the kind of creepy, speculative, like near future. Is that right? I actually never read Black Mirror or watched Black Mirror, but yeah, I've heard a lot about it because one of my first books that was shelved was comped to it. So
okay, yeah, as I said it, I was like, wait, am I making this name up? Because but yeah, this idea of being like 1 degree and also almost like an illusion and an imitation of ourselves, and like these layers of imitation upon imitation, and how that would really make you kind of hate it sometimes and also kind of feel like you're trapped in a role.
Yeah.
I want to now talk about the revenge in Immortal Dark, since revenge is obviously a huge theme and a huge part of the plot. And so I would love if you could talk to us about your main character, what drew you to the theme of the revenge, because what I loved specifically also about Immortal Dark and its discussion of revenge is it reminded me of this quote that I had read or heard somewhere basically, which is that revenge is just this all-consuming kind of obsessive emotion. And so the quote is actually, while seeking revenge, dig 2 graves, one for yourself. And so I would love to know also about your thoughts about that quote in relation to the theme in your book.
Yeah, that quote really fits the theme of the book, especially the digging graves part. So Kidan is determined to find June, her sister that has been kidnapped, and quickly we learn she's willing to do anything. There's no line she won't cross. And I love writing characters with a revenge arc because they're very active on the page. They're not waiting for things to happen to them. They're going out there to make things happen. And I think a lot of people ask me, why Kidan? Because she is quite a very twisted, depressed individual. And I'm like, she gets things done. That's why I want to write about her. I keep wanting to find out what is she going to do next in order to find her sister. And the moment they're trapped in the house with the vampire that's been accused of taking her sister, we see this back and forth of games between them. So she does things to make him leave the house. He does things to make her leave the house. And they start off really very not great, and then it escalates quite dramatically to violence to each other. And each time they do that against one another, it backfires on Kidan, and she thinks she's getting the upper hand by attacking the vampire violently, but then she gets punished equally in another form. Maybe the university punishes her, or the house punishes. There's a lot of heightened emotions in that house because the house is quite, in a way, alive, and her own sister is haunting her in that house as well. So even though she thinks her revenge path is gonna heal some part of her, at each point it quite backfires. And that's what the quote quite relates to that, because she's digging a grave for herself as well as, the vampire. And that theme is quite explored as they go on, because they end up at a place where neither of them can win unless they work together. And I love when a revenge arc changes into like an alliance arc. And that's what happens in this book. And that's also what happens within Kidan herself. She goes from always attacking herself and others to accepting herself. So she's no longer digging that grave in a way, even though she still digs it for other people. She's a murderous character. She's not consumed by self-hatred, because revenge often has this hatred inside of you that's just all-consuming. So Kidan's journey becomes, how can I go on this path of taking my sister back without destroying myself at the same time? And it's quite interesting, because Immortal Dark is about accepting your darkness. So sort of revenge is darkness, and you can also accept that in a way. But I go about it hopefully in a way that's still healing, because she does it with a group of friends, a group of people around her. And because she starts off at a place of also just wanting to destroy herself as well as others, now it just becomes about maybe destroying others and not herself. And I think I just love that we don't lose the theme of darkness, because that's still important, because it is a quite a dark story about exploring all of the lines we will cross as humans and how we cross them with immortal creatures and how they help us sort of accept those twisted, really wretched parts of ourselves. But within that, I feel like at the same time, your revenges can be done in a way that doesn't harm you. I believe that. So in the end, I think Kidan finds a way that she can still work with people to protect her sister and all of that without also significantly causing damage to herself.
Yeah, I love that. I think also at the beginning, and that's kind of what I was also thinking about when I was thinking of this question, we have this kind of intense isolation, which sort of makes this echo chamber and this like maelstrom basically of all these emotions, and you kind of don't lose that thread of why she's there, but you show that like there are other relationships in this world, and like there are other ways to connect with people in going towards the same goal, going towards different goals. It doesn't have to be this kind of isolated experience.
Yes, for sure. I think companionship with others is like one of the biggest themes in the book as well. It's like, if you're by yourself, basically death is being by yourself, and being alive and well is with others. And I really love exploring that.
I love that as well. Also, and whenever anyone ever tells me that I shouldn't try to get revenge, I'm just going to tell them revenge gets stuff done.
It does, though. That's the problem. It does. I feel like it's like you have to sacrifice a piece of yourself when you go on a revenge path. And sometimes that sacrifice might be worth it. Sometimes it's not. And so I'm like torn on revenge arcs. Sometimes my characters realize, no, I can't do this, and they turn back. But sometimes they plot ahead and then they're a completely different person. And I love exploring how that, changes them as well. So we'll find out what happens to Kidan in book 2 and 3.
Yeah. One of my favorite themes in The Dark We Know was the way and like the idea of the past refusing to stay silent, sort of whispering to us, continuing to sort of be there and almost haunt us, basically. And I'm really interested to know how you decided to mix the idea of the past and the supernatural specifically.
Yeah. Whenever I talk about The Dark We Know, it's like half of it I can't fully take credit for. So in The Dark We Know, there is a second POV, so most of it is written from Issa's POV. And there is also a series of interludes, which is told by this supernatural entity, that delves a lot into different characters. It delves into the past. It sort of haunts them. It sort of possesses them. It sort of invades their like fears and invades their insecurities. And I don't want to spoil too much about how it works, but it is quite a literal whispering. It sort of is on the wind. It's the song that they keep hearing in the back of their heads. It's the worst voice in the back of their head. And I think that works for me on a very like metaphorical level, on a very like, a lot of how like mental illness or how depression or how anxiety has always worked for me is that there's always sort of a sense of something else being in me, or something else, voices in my head in a sense. So I think that sense of whispering and that sense of haunting, I think grief and trauma, and mental illness or depression, I think it sort of sits alongside haunting very naturally, and that just sort of bled into the book with the themes of the book and where the characters are at. On a literal level, how I came up with that supernatural entity. So Spring Awakening, in its original form, is not a speculative piece, but it is written very poetically. There's a lot of like imagery in there, and one of the recurring motifs in the musical is this angel. So in the musical, it sort of represents different things. It sort of represents them being haunted by their own like sexuality. It is a lot about like repressed sexuality and repressed autonomy over their own bodies. So that is something that sort of haunts them. But I just loved how this angel figure kept recurring and recurring. They talk about this angel on the wind. They talk about, the angel like looking through the window at them. And because my brain like goes in speculative directions, I think I just sort of grabbed that and was like, okay, make it real, and just like ran in that direction. So we basically have this angel again, like sort of the religious themes tie in there, but we have this angel that's sort of been haunting them, that sort of gets in their heads, and it dredges up all these things from their past, and it's followed them all through childhood into teenagehood, and it both, I think, reminds them of, but also represents all this grief and all this trauma and all this shame and all this insecurity that they've always carried with them. And part of confronting it is confronting all these parts of themselves. And I think ultimately that is sort of what the story is about, and it is about coming to terms with your own past and reconciling with your own past and giving your younger self grace, but also being able to let go of that past, and that younger self who you will just not be able to return to, even if you're yearning for this innocence again, you're yearning for your friends to be alive again. I think sort of holding on to that is also a big part of the baggage that these characters carry, because it's a lot of guilt, and it's a lot of regret. And I think a lot of it is learning to let go, and learning to let go together specifically. I really liked what Tigger said about death is sort of being alone, and like a lot of the book is about companionship, because yeah, I think a lot about like healing, and a lot about like moving from like a dark place to a slightly less dark place. I know Immortal Dark is like we just talked about it being about darkness, but I think moving from like a dark alone place to a dark place with agency, and where you're like taking control of your own story, I think that's a big part of it. And I think like finding your people is a big part of that. And I think for Issa specifically, she finds that in reuniting with someone from her past and reuniting with these people from her past, and finding a way to like move forward together. um, and so yeah, I think the past is something that I think about a lot. I think it comes up in a lot of my books, and I'm always trying to like not write the same themes, but I think it's always in my head, so you'll probably see me like rehash some of it. But yeah, it's quite literally metaphorically, on a lot of levels, it is about the way that their past selves come back to haunt them, and how they confront that.
Yeah, because I think one of the things that you brought up, and that's why I thought about this question in relation to your book as well, is like how this idea of the past, even in a non-supernatural world and like a non-supernatural context, can already be given so much agency and like so much of a voice, even without necessarily needing to have a specific supernatural entity to it. And so I really love that mixing of like what you've done there. I now want to ask, we've already talked a little bit about the battle scenes in The Girl with No Reflection, but I want to ask a little bit more about the battle scenes, and also specifically, one of the things I also loved is how you play with this idea about discoveries about the world. And you kind of mentioned it before with like the whole mirror world, but discoveries about the world and how our home sort of work. And I would love to know as well how you time the discoveries specifically for characters and also, I guess, also for readers for your book.
Yeah, so I guess one thing that I didn't want to do is like sort of put all of the lore like early on in the book. So like I feel like it always is nice to discover parts about the world and the history of the world like alongside the characters. In this case, the main character, because that's the only point of view that I wrote from, Ying's character. So yeah, I guess like with the battle scene, I think like you know, I had a whole back history of like 1,000 years ago, there was like a different war, and that was how the mirror people came to be cursed to mimic humans to begin with. And again, that's like a prequel I would like really love to write from a different perspective, because I think that would be like a really interesting exploration of like how the mirror world sort of came to be. But I sort of mentioned this a little bit before about how like I don't think humans, like we as humans are not really like equipped or evolved to like see ourselves like so much. And I wrote that a little bit in one of the lines where you know, before like mirrors were invented, which obviously like was a long, long time ago in our world, and also a long, long time ago in this world, like we never really saw like reflections of ourselves. Like it was only ever through like water bodies and you know, shiny natural surfaces that we would sort of see a reflection of ourselves. And so, you know, we would only get like glimpses of like the mirror world and ourselves like through these sort of like these water bodies. And that's how like the myth of like mer people and stuff came about, because, you know, I guess like humans early on might not have realized like, you know, what they were actually seeing. And so, yeah, I think sort of like creating these two worlds like in parallel that then clashed and then came apart and then were like sort of tied together in such a like sort of traumatic way because of the last war. And then were sort of tied together because one side were kind of pretty much like oppressed and like made to mimic like the human side. I think that that would have been such a breeding ground for resentment. And so I kind of like wanted to explore the idea in the battles that like there wasn't necessarily like one side that were like the villain and one side that was the hero, even though you're seeing it from the main character's perspective. And, you know, she has a certain like, you know, I guess hard-headedness about her that makes her think she's always in the right, because that's how she was like brought up. And I think we sort of talked a bit about how like sibling dynamics earlier. We talked about in the conversation about like the eldest daughter versus like middle children versus like youngest children. And in this book, like my main character is the youngest child, so she's always like been super indulged. I don't want to like say too much about youngest children, because, you know, I have a younger sister whom I love and is not like that at all. So yeah, basically like she grew up very indulged and you know, always being kind of, I guess, made to feel like she was in the right, and that she had like sort of, you know, that she had like utmost agency, and that she was always sort of like the hero of her own story. And I think like coming into this new world where she's coming into like this new royal family because she's been, you know, entering into an arranged marriage with the crown prince, she realizes that actually like the world is so much bigger than just her little family unit that was always like very protective of her, and where she was always the baby and she was always babied and she was always looked after and she was always protected and she was always like made to feel like her voice was so important. And then she comes into this other situation where that wasn't the case, and then the world expands even more because it's not just like the imperial palace and the royal family that she's having to deal with. Now it's this whole other mirror world that contains like you know, a person that looks identical to her but had a completely different backstory and a completely different experience, and who has suffered trauma and things like that throughout her life. So yeah, I think it was sort of like about learning that her perspective was not like the only perspective in the world, and trying to sort of, you know, get her to see other points of view. And then the battle scene was really like exploring how those two people would clash after such a long period of animosity, and also of the mirror people having to mimic humans and therefore having to mimic very like terrible acts as well. So I think that that was something that I wanted
to bring in, because I think that, you know, there was also another line where one of the characters explains that the Mirror people actually were originally peaceful, but then they were forced to sort of like witness and all of these depraved acts and all of this violence and the worst of humanity, basically, and also mimic it, which would be very traumatic to experience. And so therefore they, you know, they've developed resentment and bitterness, as well as like been almost trained into this sort of way of being that reflects the worst parts of humanity. And I think that's kind of what I wanted to say overall. Like that was like the ultimate message, is that like humans are actually often like the villain, even though we always think that we are like, you know, the heroes of the story. Like we are, if you like approach you know, like a view of humanity from anyone, including like the planet or including animals, like we would probably be like the biggest villains in our universe. So yeah, so that's sort of like the ultimate message. And so yeah, in the end, it was about like no one being necessarily in the right. And that's why I'd love to write more in this world, because I think it's such an interesting sort of concept to explore. And it's really hard to like get enough into like a single book to sort of really deeply probe that idea. But yeah, yeah, there's a lot I want to say.
I'm so here for a prequel. I feel like I'm ready to start the change.org petition.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those things where yeah, like I think if there's enough sort of reasoning behind writing a prequel, then like yeah, hopefully I'll get like the chance to one day, or otherwise it'll just exist in my head. But yeah, that's like a massive twist that I have in my head that I would love to write as well. And it'll all be from like Mape's point of view, which is like my favorite character. So yeah, hopefully fingers crossed.
Yeah, I want to read it now.
Yes, I'm fully on board for this. And I love what you were saying also about like the invention of the mirror. I feel like it's something I never really thought about, but now will also like just haunt me, as as so many of the mirrors in your books haunt me the rest of the year, at least, for me to just like think about what that has done for us as people.
Yeah, and then the step further is obviously social media and filters and all this sort of stuff that I think like our brains are not equipped to handle, because we are really like just cave people, like in terms of like our brain development, like we have stopped evolving beyond that point. And so like being able to like see ourselves like in such stark like clarity, it is probably like quite a difficult thing to, you know, to manage. I find it anyway. I mean, you guys are all beautiful, so but, it's not something I think that we like our brains are very good at handling. And so yeah, that's something that that I really thought about a lot when I was writing this.
Yeah, I'm gonna be thinking about this for a while now. I want to ask now something that we talked about briefly for like a second earlier in the panel. I want to know who is a speculative fiction author you loved growing up, right? Like maybe someone that you read when you were growing up that you thought that you wanted to sort of do something similar to that, or, you know, one that really inspired you, basically.
Well, I think I mentioned before that I grew up reading epic fantasy. I think like those of us who read fantasy when we were younger probably only really read like a few fantasy authors, because that was all that was like around. And I think probably all of us have talked a lot about how, you know, we grew up probably like not reading very diverse fiction because it just wasn't there. So yeah, I'm a very basic bitch and grew up reading and Game of Thrones and stuff like that. And yeah, that was pretty much like what turned me on to fantasy. But now it's amazing that we can kind of, yeah, like read like Black fantasy and like East Asian fantasy and South Asian fantasy and like, you know, Pacific Islander fantasy. Like we just have so many more like availabilities to read diverse viewpoints and fantasy and mythologies from like around the world, which is amazing.
Yeah, for sure. Same with me. Because I grew up in Ethiopia, I didn't have a lot of like the Western authors, like the famous authors. I would just read traditionally folklore stories back then. But then when I moved here, I think I got into paranormal romance heavily. So like the Vampire Academy series by Rochelle Mead, that and the Vampire Diaries and Twilight, those really gave me the love of because before I was reading about slaying monsters, and now it's like you can love a monster, you can fall in love with them, they can be beautiful. And I was like, whoa, that concept is just so interesting. So those books truly put me on to fantasy. And then now it's like Leah Bardugo and R.F. Kuang, all these amazing fantasy writers. I'm always inspired by them. And Children of Blood and Bone by Tomi Adeyemi, when that one came out, it was the first, I think, YA African fantasy that I've seen widely received. It was just amazing. And I was like, that gave me so much inspiration to write an entirely Black cast of characters and African characters. So there's so much diverse authors now that I can actually look up to, which is amazing. And yeah, the inspiration is always flowing.
Yeah, I think same. I think it's nice to talk about to be on a panel with like other international authors and other like BIPOC international authors, because I think like the way that we access books is probably slightly different than if you were living in the US and the way if you were living in the UK, and we sort of have a more limited selection. So yeah, I think I grew up on a lot of like the popular series. I was like a big like Rick Riordan kid. Before that, I was big into like Enid Blyton, who is like this British, kids author, a lot of like fairy tales. So I think the love for like fantasy worlds really started very young. I couldn't like pinpoint like one specific thing. I was a big like Star Wars kid. But yeah, I think like both Kush and Tigas has said, I think this is always such an interesting question that I get asked. I think we all probably get asked a lot. It's like, who inspired you as a kid? Like who inspired your writing when you were younger? But for me, it's always been I've always been a reader. I've always enjoyed reading. I've always been into fantasy, but I wouldn't start pinpointing like authors that really inspired me or like books that really inspired me until like 5 years ago maybe. And it was really like that start of like seeing more diverse fantasy and like picking up like the Poppy War and picking up like Jade City and like finding like more of these Asian authors and how they are tackling speculative fiction, that I started going, okay, this is kind of what I want to write, and figuring out what I wanted to write. And what I'm writing now is very much grounded in, I think, what I was finding 5 years ago as opposed to 15 years ago. So it's always like 2 points in my life that I feel inspired by.
I love that.
Yeah, I think a lot of us were probably inspired to start writing because of the more recent authors, because I guess before that, it just didn't seem very achievable, like unless you were, like an old white man, like, it was going to be hard to be published. And so,
I agree.
Was very inspiring. I agree as well.
Yeah, I definitely echo what everyone was saying as well about like when you find yourself or when you see even the possibility of something like that even happening, right? The eye-opening experience of one knowing that something even becomes a possibility versus kind of just things that you read or consume that are just like not for a possible future for yourself, and then sort of that changing and finding books and like communities and stuff that sort of help that experience happen, I guess is what I want to say.
Yeah, like you go from being on the sidelines to like playing on the field is like a really big step.
Yes. I want to thank everyone so much, everyone who was watching the panel. Also, thank you as well to everyone, all of my amazing author panelists who have chatted about their books. I have just been loving it so much that I've been like forgetting to prepare the next question, waiting for it because I'm just thinking and listening to everything everyone is saying. I have left everybody's book link down below in the description box, so please make sure to check it out. Make sure to pick up books and do all the great things at it and like request at your library, things like that. And I would love to just thank everyone as well for coming. I've enjoyed this panel so much, and I wish everyone a good rest of your day wherever you are.
Thank you so much for having
Thanks
me.
so much for
Thank
having
you.
us.